And 3, 2, 1. And we are live. Welcome to the Prefessional podcast, episode number 7. So since my last podcast, since episode 6, I stated that I wanted to try out the Heroic Aberrus and that my overall goal was to obtain the AOTC before, the next raid. And since then, I've cleared Heroic Aberrus. I obtained my AOTC. I obtained it that week. And since then, I also cleared it a second time. Up to Notorious. So Sarkareth, I've only downed him once, and I'm going to talk about him a little bit in this podcast as well. So first of all, I just want to go ahead and I'm going to go through and give my overall thoughts on every single boss inside of Aberrus, looking at it from the heroic perspective. And I already did this in one of the previous episodes with the normal and LFR, and I gave my general thoughts on how I felt about it, but I'm going to do it about heroic now. So when you jump into Heroic Aberrus, it is a little bit of a change up from the normal. It's a little less forgiving, and it does introduce some extra mechanics. But it is puggable, and I completed Aberrus with a pug. I did not do it with a guild. I did not do it with any type of really organized group. It was just a bunch of randoms, and I'm going to talk about that as well. But let me go through the bosses here, and I'm just going to talk about how I feel about them and just some general thoughts. So we'll start off obviously with Sarkareth, who is the very first boss. And on heroic difficulty, there really wasn't a whole lot difference between that and normal. Great introductory boss, simple mechanics. Other than just the damage kind of ramping up a little bit more, there's really not a whole lot to worry about there. The only real change from the heroic difficulty is when you move to the amalgamation chamber. And because you can't group up the elementals, they obtain a buff if they get too close, and they deal like 200% damage. But at least with the group that I was in, we were able to somewhat cheese it. It's not mandatory to get both elementals down to 50%. You can put everybody on the exact same side and just zerg down either the fire or the shadow down to 50%, and that will trigger the intermission into phase 2 where you fight the final boss. And the final guy, I liked him on the heroic difficulty. He adds, it added some different abilities and things like that. Overall, still a really smooth fight. I don't think there's much of a difficulty jump from the amalgamation, from Sarkareth to the amalgamation chamber. So I think the two first bosses were still pretty simple, pretty easy. If you can do them on normal, you shouldn't have really any difficulty doing them on the heroic level. The first real check comes with the Forgotten Experiments. On the heroic difficulty, boss 1, really not that big of a deal. He still does the charge, the rending charge, that's still present. But the second boss, when it comes to the dispellable debuffs, that's a real raid check. And I found that when I've pugged twice on both clears, our raid always falters on this guy. So not necessarily phase 2 of the Forgotten Experiments, but phase 3, because you see the debuff persists through phase 2 into phase 3, the last boss. And if the raid doesn't understand to group that debuff into the same spot, then it just becomes like really overwhelming, and to the point that it causes a wipe, because you can't deal with the ad management that well. So other than that, moving on past that, you go to the Assault of the Zakali, and in heroic, really not a whole lot of difference there either. Just comes down to a little bit more communication. Still, that's actually a really, really enjoyable fight. I think it's one of my favorite boss fights in this raid, because of dealing with the ad management, them scaling the walls, and then dealing with the final guy himself. Just a really, really fun fight. The main difference is with the when he's slamming into the wall in phase 2, like after you deal with the ads and he moves to the wall, you have to have half of the raid soak the first attack, and then half the raids soak the second attack, and then it has to rinse and repeat like that. You can't soak both of the slams back to back, otherwise you just pretty much die. So who's after him? Who's after Zakali? Rashok, the Elder. Probably, I would say this is another one of the more easy bosses. It's fairly it doesn't require a whole lot, but still a really good fight. If you can do it on normal, you should have really no issue on the heroic level. I think the main difference between like normal and heroic, honestly, is just the amount of damage that you're dealing with. I think Rashok deals a lot more damage in the heroic, and it makes it's harder on the healers, especially in the intermission phase when you're draining his energy. The fire damage, the raid damage is quite intense, and it can be very taxing on your healers. I think that's honestly the main roadblock there. But again, you know, overall not too difficult, not much changes. So leading from Rashok, you go to Skarn, and Skarn on the heroic difficulty, I want to say the first pug we didn't wipe. The first pug, or no, I'm pretty sure we wiped on Skarn, and that more so just came down to like the bomb management. Overall, the playing in the background is actually Neltharion on heroic, and that just finished. So I'm going to rewind it and just go to a different boss here. Let me see. So yeah, here's the Forgotten Experiments. You can see the Revenants when they're being dispelled in the wrong spot. They'll just kind of start overwhelming. And I want to say one of the first times we did this, there were Revenants like all over the place because of the amount of dispelling that was going on. So yeah, you can see I'm joining up here all the orbs and stuff because we didn't put them in the right spot initially. You're supposed to wait. The person who has the debuff needs to hold on to it for a while, and the healers need to wait before it gets dispelled. So anyway, Skarn. I think the main issue with Skarn was just the ability of actually being able to see the bombs, because that's what ended up causing us to wipe a few times, or at least once. I don't think we wiped twice, because you know, after the first wipe, we pretty much communicated and it's like, hey, you know, if you have an immunity, grab a bomb, like just do it, because it's very Skarn is one of those fights where it starts to get a little bit harder to see what exactly is going on because of everything that's actually on the ground and the effects and everything. So with the Dragonfire traps, he's a really fun boss. He's a really cool boss. I like him, but it is a little bit difficult to like see things that's going on. So Skarn resulted in a wipe, but you know, good communication, and you know, he was pretty much two-shot. So he's also another kind of like a hiccup as far as like pugs and stuff. But it just comes down to, you know, it's a pug, so communication is honestly the biggest factor when it comes to like not performing well in a raid like this. So after Skarn, you move on to Magmarox, who is, in my opinion, the easiest boss in the dungeon. It's as close to a tank and spank as you're going to get. I think Kazara might be the next one. Or no, I would say Rashok is probably the next one. But Magmarox, really not difficult. Not a whole lot changes with that either. It comes down to soaking the amount of the fire puddles and things like that. Really simple, really easy boss. He was one shot. And then going to Neltharion. I think Neltharion was like the next true like test as far as like a heroic pug, because of the amount of damage that he does. Neltharion's a hard-hitting boss, and it does have quite a few more mechanics at play compared to the previous bosses. That pretty much came down to, I think the first couple times we wiped were just because of people being, you know, not really sure of what they were doing. So a couple people were breaking walls. And once that was fixed, then it just came down to, you know, if you have the corruption debuff, a lot of people don't really, you could tell who wasn't sure what was going on, because they had the corruption. They were still like standing next to the boss DPSing. You know, and this is all coming from a tank perspective, because that's what I do. So definitely, those are the two main issues with him. And then the third thing is in phase 3, the ads, they get really, really nasty when the fight persists, because their damage ramps where they get buffed. That caused us to wipe a few times, and it was just more so because people were solo focusing the boss and not so much an AoE farm. And don't get me wrong, you can actually manage that if you have a high enough DPS. You can just completely single target and almost ignore the ads and burn him down the last percentage with a Bloodlust. But overall, you really need to focus on making sure that the ads go down, because if you don't have the DPS for the single target, then you need to be able to kill the ads. That way they don't wipe the group, because the stacks get so intense and there's so many of them that it'll pretty much just one shot you. Like even with my cooldowns and stuff, I'll like hit PuG and immediately die. Like there's no, not enough I don't have enough damage reduction in order to survive. You can see this playing in the background. It's the Forgotten Experiments where we have like all the remnants still alive, and it resulted in a wipe. So Neltharion was definitely a huge test, but it was a really fun fight. I enjoy it as a tank. I think he's a great introduction to the last boss. So let me talk about Sarkareth, because he's the main one. My experience with Heroic Aberrus was I wanted to pug it, so I found a group. I think the very first group I found ended up wiping on Kasara just because the people didn't know what they were doing, and it pretty much fell completely apart after the first wipe, which was fine because that group wasn't going to make it anyway. So then I left, joined another one that had experienced people in it, and we went through the entire dungeon and stopped at Neltharion. I then, I want to say start to finish, it probably took me about 3.5 hours to go through Heroic Kasara all the way till Neltharion. You know, from a PUG perspective, obviously. You know, if you're running with a guild or a solid group of friends, it's not going to be like that. It's not going to take that long. But, so I wanted to get Sarkareth down, obviously, you know, to get the AOTC. And so I started looking for some other additional groups. Actually, I stopped playing and then I came back later that night and started trying to find some PUGs. Sarkareth is a completely different level in terms of a fight. When you compare Sarkareth to the rest of the bosses, there's really no comparison. In terms of damage, in terms of mechanics, he is the top. Like, he is the most difficult, and I want to say I spent about 3 hours on Sarkareth alone. Probably spent a good 1.5 hours with the same exact group. And that's the one that we actually downed it on. But, you know, multiple attempts with it. And then I found a group and we got him down to like 10% and then 2%, like multiple times. So it kind of kept pushing and we ended up getting him down. But Sarkareth, in terms of difficulty compared to the rest of the bosses, was just astronomically different. And you really have to be on top of your game in order to down him. I mean, I'm just going to be honest about it. You know, phase 1 is not super difficult. It all comes down to, you know, again, it all goes back to it. You know, it's a PUG, so communication is the biggest issue. And communicating what's going to happen and what's going on and things like that made all the difference in the world. So it takes a lot of communication. It takes a lot of people knowing what exactly they need to do, you know, as far as clearing debuffs, bomb management, and then, like, even more so, just the positioning and transitions. That's, you know, positioning is 90% the Sarkareth fight, more than anything. You know, the ads aren't horribly bad, not like as far as taking them down and things like that. So it really comes down to a lot of like the positioning. So speaking of that, thoughts on the final bosses. Obviously Sarkareth is the hardest. Neltharion is the second hardest. I would say the Forgotten Experiments is actually the third hardest. Followed by Skarn. And then it just kind of goes down from there. I guess maybe Zakali. Then the Amalgamation Chamber. Then Rashok. And then Kasara. I think that's how I would rank them as terms of difficulty from hardest to easiest. So let me give you some thoughts on like pugging. Pugging is interesting. It's very interesting. The biggest downfall when it comes to being in a PUG is communication. I'm sorry, I think my music stopped, so I'm looking here to see. I think there it goes. Okay. So the biggest issue with PUGs is communication. That's what it comes down to, because, you know, you're using, pretty much everybody uses chat. I don't think anybody uses the in-game chat, like with microphones and voices and things like that. I want to check it. Because my idea here is I'm going to be, I'm going to try to PUG Mythic Aberrus as well. And communication is definitely needed. I found that out with Heroic. I don't mind heroic at all. Heroic is completely doable even as a pug, as long as you're selective in who you're bringing in. And then you just have to communicate everything before the battle actually starts and hope that everybody can kind of realize what's going on and do what they need to do. The biggest thing with that is just you can't really do call outs. It's very difficult to do call outs in the middle of a raid as it's going on without, a voice. It's much, the raid warning, you have that, but it's not very noticeable. A lot of people are too busy staring at their bars or things like that. They don't really pay attention to the text on the screen that flashes. So, there's a huge advantage of voice over text, obviously. But when it comes to being in a PUG, that is the biggest hurdle as in terms of actually overcoming the content, is just the communication aspect of it. Another thing is actually keeping a group together. I found this out when I was leading my heroic raid, the second one. I was raid leader for the second heroic raid. The biggest issue with that is that if there's a wipe, and there's going to be a wipe, people, mistakes and things happen, but if there's a wipe, people will immediately jump out. Like, they'll just dip out. Like, there's nothing, it's kind of weird. I get that, it is a pug and people have other things that they have to do or whatever, but it's weird how most of the time it happens like after a wipe. You'll lose like 4 to 5 people. And it's really annoying. That really kills the synergy that you have with the group, but at the same time, it can also help you. But that's more so what causes the heroic raid to be so time consuming, is just the fact that you have to, wait so long in order to refill your group. You wipe, so then you have to run all the way back. You have to rebuff. Do all that, and then you have to fill your group in. So just a word of advice to people who are trying to lead their own group. This is what I would say. Okay, open up the queue, open up the finder, start bringing people in. Once you reach max, re-queue. Leave it up there and just put in the title, Heroic Aberrus Reserve. Because then people can queue up and just be in like a waiting room until you need them. So if somebody has to dip out immediately, you have a list of people you can choose from and bring them in. So overall, that's kind of like the main thing that inhibits a pug, is just the communication aspect and people leaving. But like I said, the thing is like, okay, so when I'm a raid leader, and let me just say, like, I'm going to be doing Mythic. I've already tried Mythic Kasara. The jump, let me just say this, okay? The difference between Heroic and Mythic is massive, like absolutely massive. The health difference and damage difference from Kasara Heroic to Kasara Mythic is massive. And like in Heroic, you can get away with not having the adequate DPS. As long as people are doing mechanics, their DPS can be lower and you can still survive. You can still be fine. On Mythic, that is not the case. We had, some people were doing phenomenal on DPS, but there were like 3 to 4 people that were right around 50k DPS. We did not have the DPS required to down Kasara. And that was even with like having almost pretty much everybody alive to phase 3. It just wasn't there. The damage required is massive. And there's an additional mechanic thrown in on Mythic difficulty, and that's when you're being chased by the beam. If it touches another beam or another path or another like ground effect, it will actually deal raid-wide damage, so it can't touch anything. We had people that were doing mechanics fairly successfully well, but again, it just, we didn't have the DPS to do it. So the difference is massive, and that's what I'm glad I jumped into a pug just to see what it was like. So what I'm going to do is, because I'm going to pug Mythic Aberrus, I have the utmost confidence that I could get a group together to down Kasara. I have the utmost confidence that we could down the Amalgamation Chamber. I don't think it would go past the Forgotten Experiments just because of the difficulty. But in terms of like the pug itself, Mythic difficulty is a whole nother ball game. You have to be much more strict. You have to be much more stringent in who you're inviting. And, I'm all for making, like, people make mistakes. Things happen. Okay, I make mistakes. I'm a tank. I still make mistakes. It's fine. You know, as long as you learn from it, as long as you don't do it again, then that's okay. As long as you don't die to something really simple and stupid, then that's okay. But in Mythic, there is really no room for it. So, you know, it would be a very much more strict group comp. So, you know, if you're pulling suboptimal DPS, if you're under 50k in a Mythic raid, then you're gone. Like, there's no way you should be in that group. Everybody needs to be doing well over 60. And, you know, obviously that changes depending. Well, it's not going to change because the group comp is always going to be the same. It's the maximum is, you know, Mythic is consistently the 20 players. So yeah, just, I think Kasara is definitely doable. Kasara is definitely doable, like 100% doable. But I would definitely go with either using the in-game voice chat or using like Discord and being like, look guys, if you want to do this Mythic PUG, we can do it, but you need to be in voice chat. You need to listen because it takes a lot of communication in order to be successful at that. And that's the main thing that the PUGs do. Heroic is no big deal. Heroic's completely doable without any type of voice communication. It just, Mythic is a completely different ballgame. So with that being said, since I do now have AOTC, I'm going to finish up with my Mythic Plus rating. It's been slacking on it, but I'm trying to get like videos and stuff out too while getting, you know, the raid goals and things that I want to do. So my Mythic rating's kind of falling behind. I'm going to go ahead and take care of that in the next couple of weeks here. I'm going to get up over 2k, which shouldn't be difficult considering all of my gear is like massive. I think the only thing that I'm really struggling with right now is a trinket. And then my boots. I think my boots are champion. Yeah, my boots are champion. And then I have one trinket that is still raid finder level. Actually, it's the Notharian trinket. So it's a really good trinket. I just haven't been able to find one or haven't been able to win one in terms of upgrading. But I think gear is really good. You know, and I'm geared for Mythic 17s. I'm pretty much geared for almost Mythic 20s, honestly. It just comes down to finding a group that's willing to do it and willing and gonna succeed. So what do I want to talk about here as far as that? Oh, I'll give some final thoughts on the gear itself too. I actually really enjoy the season 2 gearing system. I think it's phenomenal. I hope they follow through, and they said they're going to follow through with it going into season 3. Mythic rating has the top tier gear. Mythic rating is the hardest tier content in the game, so it's definitely fitting. It works really well. And upgrade paths, everything really, really great. I do wish that they had done better, like describing the crafting system, because I wasted a lot of Shadow Flame sparks crafting gear and I didn't need to. So I didn't realize that you had to have another spark in order to recraft gear. I thought once you made it, then it was good. You just had to apply, you know, new materials in order to upgrade that gear. So I handicapped myself a little bit, but hopefully by the end of this week, I'll have a couple crests that I can, you know, use in order to get my crafted gear up. What else do I want to talk about? Just some final thoughts. I'm working on a Mythic Plus video. I know it's taking some time. I left a comment up on my community page. You know, I apologize. It's taking longer than I had thought. That's why I'm doing this podcast, just to help kind of get some type of content out, because it's been a little stale, a little dry. You know, YouTube is my hobby. I do it on the side. I do it in my free time, but lately I've been slammed at work and slammed with schoolwork. So I really have not had the full amount of time and focus in order to put into my script. My script is pretty much completely finished. I went through and I fine-tuned a lot of it and just kind of going through and like touching up. So the script is almost done. It won't take very long to actually put the video together, just because it's kind of a it's kind of like an insight video. It's not really, it is a guide, but it's not like the normal, you know, use these 5 tips to become a better Mythic Plus player. It's more so giving you insight on what you need to do in order to actually become a better player. But anyway, if you want to talk, if you want to chat or things like that, please join the Discord. You know, trying to get a good community going, and as well, I'm not exactly sure how the grouping system works. I can't remember. I don't know if you can only group with players that are on the same realm cluster, or if you can group with people, or like if you have to be like BattleNet friends or whatever. But regardless, if we are able to group together, I'm going to start doing heroic raids and leading them, just to get some other people through. I'm really trying to get the the Neltharion trinket. That's like my main goal. I'm really not super worried about downing Sarkareth again, just because he's such a difficult boss to down that it's not really worth my time. But anyway, yeah, join up the Discord. Oh, the Mega Dungeon. I've not done that yet. I'm going to try to jump into that this week. At some point, I'm going to run through it. I'll see how it goes. I might do a real quick video on that too. I guess it depends, because it's supposed to be fairly... excuse me. It's supposed to be very difficult in terms of like a dungeon. Not necessarily difficult like as in, you know, like a raid or whatever, but it's more mechanically intensive than the regular dungeons. And it's tuned for heroic gear, which is pretty awesome. So other than that, that's all I got to say. Thank you guys. I'll see you in the next one.